Have you ever wondered why life rewards some and leaves others behind? The answer lies in this story of two brothers who inherited the same land, the same opportunities, the same sky above them. One embraced discipline and learned from the smallest creatures. The other chose comfort and delay, and their endings could not have been more different. Once upon a time, in a vast prairie nestled between rolling hills and winding creeks, there lived two brothers who were as different as the sun and the moon. They were still young men, barely in their late 20s. One was named James, a man of steady character, hard-working and quietly determined, the kind who preferred to show through his actions what others barely managed to express with their words. He had that calm strength about him, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it speaks through every calloused hand, every fence post set straight, every seed planted with care. The other brother was Robert, a dreamer with grand visions but little inclination to move his hands toward making them real. He was full of ideas, constantly talking about what he would do, what he would build, what his life would become someday. But that, someday, never seemed to arrive because he couldn't find the energy to take even the first step. Both brothers had inherited from their father a considerable stretch of land, fertile soil that had fed their family for generations. Each took his portion with the hope of building something meaningful, something that would stand as a testament to their lives. Robert spoke constantly of his dreams, his voice carrying across the fields as he lay in his hammock under the shade of an old oak tree. "Someday, I'll have a beautiful house with a wraparound porch, fields full of corn and wheat, cattle grazing as far as the eye can see," he would say, his eyes closed as if he could see it all clearly in his mind. But those words never made the journey from his lips to his hands, never transformed from vision into reality. Meanwhile, his brother James spoke very little, but he rose before dawn, planted rows of seeds with methodical precision, repaired his small cabin board by board, organized his land with careful thought, and slowly, patiently, transformed the little he had into something much greater. Between their two properties, there stood an anthill that worked without rest, a busy colony of creatures so small they could barely be seen unless you stopped to look closely. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of tiny ants marched in and out, carrying leaves many times their size, seeds, bits of food, working in perfect coordination, though they had no boss giving orders, no supervisor watching over them. James would pause each evening as the sun began to set, watching them with genuine fascination. He marveled at how these tiny creatures, without anyone telling them what to do, prepared so diligently for the coming winter, when food would be scarce and survival would depend entirely on the work done in summer. Robert, whenever he caught his brother standing there watching insects, would let out a mocking laugh that echoed across the quiet fields. "Brother, you're a fool," he would say with a dismissive wave of his hand. "How can you waste your time staring at a simple anthill when you could be resting, enjoying the breeze, dreaming about the future?" But James would respond calmly, never showing irritation at his brother's mockery, his voice steady and sure. "Robert, in these small creatures there's a great teaching, a wisdom we do well to learn from. Don't you remember what the old proverbs say? Go to the ant, you sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. For she, having no commander, no overseer, no ruler, prepares her food in summer and gathers her provision in harvest time." Robert would scoff with obvious disdain, rolling his eyes as if he'd heard this lecture 1,000 times before. "There you go again with your proverbs, James. Look, brother, those ants are slaves to their own work, always running around, always carrying things like little machines. And for what? What's the point of killing yourself like that? Life is meant for rest, for enjoyment, for dreaming, not for sweating all day like these mindless creatures." He would lean back further in his hammock, stretching his arms above his head with exaggerated contentment. "Do you see yourself in them, brother? Always so busy, always so focused on the next task. I don't want to live like an ant. I want to live like a free man, unburdened by all this endless work you put yourself through." James looked at him in silence for a long moment, studying his brother's face, seeing the contentment there that came not from accomplishment, but from avoidance, Not from building something, but from building nothing at all. "Brother, you confuse freedom with negligence," he said finally. His voice still calm, but carrying a weight that made Robert's smile falter slightly. "And remember what else the proverb says. How long will you lie there, you sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a traveler, and need like an armed man." Robert, his eyes already half closed from drowsiness, just laughed and waved his hand dismissively. "That's pure drama, James. Nothing bad is going to happen. There's plenty of time. Summer is long. The growing season stretches on forever. There will be time to work later." But even as he spoke those words, even as the sun continued its arc across the sky and the ants continued their diligent march, Robert's property grew wilder with weeds, and his hands remained empty of any real work, any real progress toward the dreams he spoke of so freely. As the months passed and the seasons began their slow turn, the difference between the two properties became impossible to ignore, as stark as day and night. On James's land, green shoots began to push through the soil, growing into strong, healthy plants that swayed gently in the breeze. There were neat rows of corn standing tall and straight, beans climbing their supports, wheat rippling like waves in a golden ocean. His cabin, which had seemed so small and fragile at first, now stood reinforced with sturdy timber and a new roof that he'd fitted himself, working late into the evenings to ensure every shingle was placed just right. Each day he added something more, a small corral for the livestock he planned to acquire, a fence line that marked his boundaries clearly, tools organized and maintained and ready for work. Everything speaking of care and forethought and steady progress. In contrast, Robert's property looked increasingly abandoned, as if no human hand touched it at all. Grass and weeds grew without control, spreading across what should have been cultivated fields. Bushes and wild growth invaded the boundaries, creeping closer to his cabin. And that cabin itself, instead of improving with time, deteriorated further with each passing week. The roof developed leaks that Robert never patched, allowing rain to seep in and damage the interior. The walls developed cracks that widened as the wood dried and contracted, gaps that would let in the cold when winter came. But Robert, lying in his hammock day after day, would sigh with that same dreamy voice, looking up at the clouds drifting by. "Someday, brother, my property will be more beautiful than yours. I'll have horses in that corral, chickens in that yard, a house built of stone with a wide porch where I can sit and watch the sunset. You'll see how it all turns out." James, with a gentle smile that held both affection and concern for his brother, would respond with patience that seemed endless. "Brother, dreams are good and necessary things, but dreams without action are like seeds that never touch the soil, that blow away in the wind and produce nothing. It's not enough to imagine what could be. You must work with diligence, with consistency, with dedication. Otherwise, time will pass, and when necessity comes knocking at your door, it will be too late for regrets, too late to undo the months and years of inaction." But Robert would just shrug his shoulders, that same careless gesture he'd perfected over the years, and reply with his usual mockery laced with defensiveness. "You're always so rushed, James, always so worried about tomorrow. Life is short, too short to spend every moment working. Better to enjoy it, to rest while we can, to savor these peaceful days. What's the point of working so hard if you never stop to appreciate what you have?" Meanwhile, the ants continued their constant march, an endless line transporting grains and bits of leaves into the depths of their colony. James would pause in his work to watch them, to meditate on their example, and he would think to himself, "They don't speak of grand plans, they don't make empty promises or talk about what they'll do someday. They simply act. Each one does her part, and together they accomplish what seem like impossible mountains of work." Robert, catching his brother once again contemplating the anthill instead of mocking him or walking away, exploded into laughter that held an edge of genuine bewilderment. Do you really think a grown man should learn lessons from creatures so insignificant, so small, they could be crushed under a boot without even noticing? James looked at him with an expression that was both serious and compassionate, the look of someone who sees trouble coming but can't force another to avoid it. Brother, he who doesn't learn from the small will not be wise with the great. Look closely at these ants, study their ways carefully, because someday you'll wish you had imitated them. Someday you'll understand what I'm trying to show you now while there's still time to change course. The long, warm days of summer, with their extended light and gentle rains that nourished the crops, began to fade gradually as autumn approached. The season was changing, and winter waited in the wings like a patient predator. The first hints of frost could be seen on the distant mountains, a white dusting that appeared overnight like a silent announcement of what was coming. And it was during winter, that harsh and unforgiving season, that crops didn't grow, that the earth gave nothing back, that survival depended entirely on what had been stored away during the months of plenty. Hey, if you're connecting with this story about choosing action over delay, drop a comment saying, "I choose to build my future today." I'd love to know this message is reaching you. And here's something interesting. Most people watching these videos haven't subscribed yet. If that's you, hit that subscribe button now. It's completely free, and you'll keep receiving more stories that inspire real change in your life. Trust me, you won't regret it. On Robert's property, very little had changed despite the passing months. Occasionally, he would plant a few seeds, but he did so without consistency, without care, never following through on what he started. His cabin remained equally deteriorated, with leaks in the roof and weak walls that would provide little protection when the cold truly arrived. His tools, a shovel and hoe and other implements that should have been in constant use, remained leaning in a corner, rusting slowly, because Robert never picked them up to clear the weeds that grew everywhere, never used them to turn the soil or prepare the ground for planting. Meanwhile, James didn't waste a single day. He woke before dawn to work the land, reinforced his home against the coming cold, gathered and stacked firewood in neat rows that would keep him warm through the longest nights, harvested his first crops, and stored them properly so they wouldn't spoil. His property was organized, clean, and in constant progress, everything speaking of a man who understood that preparation wasn't optional, that the future arrived whether you were ready for it or not. Many times Robert, lying in his hammock under the shade of his cabin's porch, would call out to his brother with that same mocking tone that had become so familiar. "Brother, why all the hurry? In the end, when we die, we take none of this with us. Better to enjoy life, to rest, to dream about possibilities instead of exhausting yourself with endless work that never seems to be finished." James, with the patience that seemed woven into his very being, would respond as he always did, never losing his temper, never showing frustration. "It's true, Robert. We won't take material things with us when we leave this world. But while we're living this life, we've been given hands to work and a mind to be responsible with what we've been entrusted. Those who don't care for what they have will soon find they have nothing left at all. And remember what the wise King Solomon said in the Proverbs, 'In all labor there is profit, but idle talk leads only to poverty.'" Robert would smile with indifference, that same careless smile that said he'd heard it all before and wasn't impressed, then close his eyes and drift back to sleep while the afternoon sun moved slowly across the sky. The summer season, that time of abundance when crops yielded their harvest and the work of spring paid its dividends, was running out day by day, and he didn't see it slipping away because his laziness had blinded him to the passage of time, to the urgency that should have driven him to action. One day, driven by a curiosity he didn't fully understand, Robert decided to approach the anthill that he'd mocked so many times, the one his brother watched every evening with such attention. He crouched down in front of it, his knees in the dirt, observing the back and forth of those tiny creatures with their incredible industry. Watching them carry leaves and seeds that were sometimes twice their own body weight, he let out that familiar, mocking laugh. "How foolish these ants are," he said to himself, but loud enough that any passing listener would hear. "They work all day without rest, without pause, without enjoying a single moment. They should sleep more, relax under the shade, take it easy. What's the point of so much effort for creatures so small they barely matter? At that moment, as if the universe itself wanted to teach him something, as if nature had been waiting for this exact opportunity, one of those ants stopped in its tracks and seemed to look directly at him. And though it was just an insect, no bigger than a grain of rice, Robert felt as though that gaze spoke directly to his soul, as though understanding passed between them that transcended words. The ant's silent message seemed to echo in his mind. This human wastes what we treasure most. He has strength we can only dream of, fertile land that would be our paradise, time measured in years instead of the brief weeks we're given, and he's letting it all slip through his fingers. We who have no voice, no reasoning mind like his, we understand that each day is precious beyond measure, and he who has everything mocks us for valuing what he throws away so carelessly. He doesn't understand that abundance isn't given freely, isn't a birthright or a guarantee. It must be built through effort, through sacrifice, through the daily choice to work, when rest seems so appealing. Those who don't sow cannot expect to reap. Those who surrender to laziness will harvest only hunger and regret. Poverty isn't born from barren soil or bad luck alone, but from the lazy heart that doesn't know how to work, that doesn't value the opportunity while it exists. We, small and fragile as we are, manage to survive and even thrive because we don't leave for tomorrow what we can do today. And this human, with all his advantages, with his size and strength and intelligence, will sink into poverty if he doesn't learn to value effort while there's still time. Robert, not understanding why, felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm afternoon. He stood up quickly, laughing nervously to cover the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in his chest. "Even the ants look at me strangely," he muttered, trying to make a joke of it. "They probably think I'm a lazy bum." He said it in a mocking tone as he walked away, but the words felt hollow, and the unease remained. From a distance, his brother James, who had been harvesting tomatoes from his garden, rows of healthy plants heavy with ripe fruit, raised his voice and called out, "Brother, why do you mock what you should be learning from? Look how the ants work without stopping, preparing what they'll need when tomorrow comes and the weather turns cold. Do the same with your life, Robert. Take advantage of the land you've been given, the opportunities that won't last forever." But Robert replied with the same disdain, though perhaps with slightly less conviction than before. "Leave them alone, brother. They're just tiny creatures following their instincts. I'm not going to live like an insect, scurrying around carrying things all day long. I prefer to live my own way, on my own terms." The truth, though he wouldn't admit it even to himself, was that Robert barely survived on a few scattered corn plants and beanstalks that he'd planted sporadically, just enough to keep from starving. And though his land was actually more fertile than his brother's, blessed with better drainage and richer soil, he never knew how to take advantage of its potential. The wealth was right there in front of his eyes, waiting to be claimed, but his laziness kept him poor while abundance surrounded him unused. Winter approached with steady inevitability. The fog grew thicker in the valleys, rolling down from the hills like a silent blanket that covered the fields each morning. The wind began to blow colder, carrying with it a whisper that chilled the skin and warned of what was coming. Migrating birds could be seen high in the sky, flying in perfect formation toward warmer lands where they could survive the harsh months ahead. The leaves on the trees turned yellow and gold and red, then fell one by one, carpeting the ground as if nature itself was closing a chapter, ending a season. It was evident to anyone paying attention that soon the fertile earth would be covered with ice and snow, and the fields would give nothing back, no matter how much you wished otherwise. Those who hadn't worked during summer would have nothing when winter arrived in full force. The ant colony, looking out at that gray and heavy sky, seemed to pause for a moment in collective reflection. One ant, perhaps older and wiser than the others, thought to herself, "Those who don't prepare their home in the time of warmth will tremble in the cold." Such is life and its unchanging patterns. Each season has its purpose, its role in the great cycle. Those who sow during abundance will reap during scarcity, but those who surrender to laziness, when winter comes, they'll find their hands empty and their hearts hungry, regretting every day they wasted, every opportunity they let slip away. Winter arrived with all its harshness, with a ferocity that seemed personal, as if the weather itself was testing each person's preparation. The wind blew fierce and freezing, stripping the last remaining leaves from the trees with violent gusts. The fields, once green and full of life, now lay covered in ice that sparkled in the weak winter sun. The earth itself became hard as stone, frozen solid, refusing to give up any food at all, no matter how desperately one might try to dig. In the ant colony's chambers deep underground, abundance reigned supreme. Mountains of stored grains and seeds filled their storage rooms, and all the members of the colony shared in the fruits of their collective effort, each ant having contributed during the warm months and now benefiting from that foresight. James, in his well-built home with its sturdy walls and solid roof, lit his fireplace each evening. He enjoyed warm bread fresh from his small oven and hot soup that gave him strength to withstand the cold, that kept his body warm and his spirits high despite the harsh weather outside. Meanwhile, Robert, the lazy brother who had mocked every warning and ignored every lesson, suffered the consequences of his negligence with an intensity he'd never imagined possible. His cabin barely protected him from the freezing wind that found every crack, every gap in the walls. His stomach, empty and aching, rumbled day and night with a hunger that never ceased. He could barely find a few dried roots and tough branches that didn't satisfy his hunger, that left him feeling hollow and weak. Trembling under his torn blankets that provided almost no warmth, he began to reflect on his choices with a clarity that comes only through suffering. Why didn't I listen? Why was I so stubborn, so foolish? James warned me again and again. The ants showed me the example every single day. And I laughed, I mocked. I thought there would always be more time, that tomorrow would be better, that somehow everything would work out without effort. But tomorrow never came the way I imagined. And now I'm paying the price of my laziness with every shivering moment, with every painful hunger pang. Robert understood too late that laziness hadn't just stolen his food and warmth. It had robbed him of peace, of comfort, of dignity, of the respect a man earns through honest work. The cold wrapped around him like a cruel embrace, and hunger reminded him every hour that life rewards those who strive and punishes those who waste their time, those who choose comfort in the moment over security in the future. Robert couldn't take it anymore. The nights had become unbearable, worse than he could have imagined in his worst nightmares during those comfortable summer days. The freezing wind squeezed through every corner of his cabin as if hunting specifically for him. His worn-out clothes and torn blankets weren't enough to protect him from the relentless cold that seemed to penetrate his very bones. Hunger twisted his insides with a pain that was both physical and emotional, and the cold penetrated his bones until he felt like he might never be warm again. With his heart full of sadness and his pride wounded but finally broken, he made a decision. He would ask his brother for help, something he'd never imagined he'd have to do. He walked with weak, stumbling steps across the frozen field, his breath coming out in white clouds until he came upon the anthill. He bent down slowly, his body stiff from cold, and saw a group of ants at the entrance, protected by small twigs and leaves they'd arranged to block the snow and wind. He watched them for a long moment, these creatures he'd mocked so thoroughly, and with his voice thick with emotion, he said to them, "You were right all along. While I sang and mocked and spent my time sleeping away the precious hours, you worked without rest, without complaint, preparing for exactly this moment. Today I understand how wise you were, how foolish I've been. I admire you, and though it's too late for me to undo my mistakes, I recognize my error and wish I had learned this lesson months ago when it could have made a difference." With that confession hanging in the cold air, Robert continued walking, each step requiring effort he barely had left until he reached his brother James's house. He knocked on the door with trembling hands, so weak he could barely make enough noise to be heard. Inside, James sat beside the fire, wrapped in a warm coat he'd made himself during the autumn months. He held a bowl of hot sweet tea in his hands and a piece of cornbread fresh from the oven, still warm and filling the room with its comforting smell. When he heard the knocking, he stood up and opened the door, not knowing what to expect. There stood his brother, lips purple from the cold, eyes sunken with exhaustion and hunger, his body shrunken and shivering uncontrollably. "Brother," Robert said with a voice so weak it was barely audible, "I can't take it anymore. I have no warmth, no food, nothing left. Please help me. I'm begging you." James looked at him with deep compassion, his heart moved by the suffering he saw in his brother's face, in his desperate eyes. But at the same time, he remembered all the warnings he'd given, all the lessons offered and rejected. And he understood that Robert needed to learn from this experience. That true help wasn't just giving him food and shelter, but helping him understand why he'd ended up in this desperate situation. "Come in, brother," he said gently, pulling Robert inside and closing the door against the bitter wind. "Sit by the fire and warm yourself." James placed a heavy blanket over Robert's shoulders and handed him a piece of bread with a bowl of hot sweet tea that steamed in the cold air. "Brother, I can't bear this anymore," Robert repeated, his voice weak and broken. "The cold is killing me slowly, and hunger keeps me awake at night, never letting me rest or forget my situation. I was wrong about everything. I thought things would work out without effort, without sacrifice, without discipline." James, calm, and looking at his brother with a mixture of compassion and firmness, responded in a voice that was kind but carried the weight of truth. "Robert, what you're feeling now is the consequence of laziness, the inevitable result of choices made over months. Winter doesn't forgive those who didn't prepare, doesn't make exceptions for good intentions or regrets. Just as summer and the growing season are the time to sow and harvest, winter is the time to enjoy what you worked for, what you stored away. Tell me, brother, what did you sow during those long, warm days?" Robert, filled with shame that burned even as his body shivered with cold, responded in barely a whisper, "Nothing, brother. I sowed nothing but wasted time and empty dreams. I laughed at you, mocked your effort and your advice, made jokes about your dedication. And now look at me, empty-handed and weak, suffering for my foolishness." "Listen carefully, Robert, because this is important to understand," James said, his voice firm but not harsh. "Poverty doesn't arrive suddenly, doesn't appear overnight like a surprise visitor. It approaches slowly, step by step, like a thief who studies the entrances to a house, who watches for weaknesses and waits for the right moment. That's how the lazy mind works, disguising itself with excuses that sound reasonable in the moment. Tomorrow, I'll do it, you tell yourself. Today, I deserve rest, you think. And when you finally realize what's happening, when you see the truth clearly, it's already too late. You have no bread, no warmth, no reserves to fall back on. Is there no hope for me then?" Robert asked, tears beginning to form in his eyes, his voice breaking with emotion. "There's always hope, brother, always a chance to change course," James replied, his voice softening slightly. "But you need to understand deeply, not just in your mind, but in your heart, that life rewards the diligent and punishes the lazy without exception. Wealth isn't just money in a bank. It's also having bread on the table when you're hungry, warmth in winter when the cold tries to break you, the respect of others who see how you conduct yourself. All of this comes from constant effort, from daily discipline, not from laziness or wishful thinking or waiting for circumstances to change by themselves." "Now I understand it completely," Robert said, his voice stronger despite his physical weakness. "Those who don't work when the sun shines will tremble when the snow falls. That's the simple truth I refuse to see." "Exactly, my brother," James confirmed with a slight nod. "Look at the ants you despised so much, the ones you laughed at for their endless work. Small creatures, fragile and easily crushed, but wise beyond measure in their understanding of life's requirements. They work without rest during summer so they won't die during winter. And you, who are human and have intelligence far beyond theirs, will you be less wise than an ant? Will you ignore the lesson even they understand instinctively? "No, brother, never again," Robert responded, his voice now firm despite his weakness, carrying a conviction that hadn't been there before. "I promise you that when spring comes and the earth thaws, I will work every day. I will sow seeds with care. I will harvest what I grow. I will earn my bread with my own hands and never again rely on empty dreams or tomorrow's promises." "That's what I needed to hear," James said with genuine warmth in his voice. "Because the real poverty isn't lack of money or possessions. It's having a lazy mind that makes excuses, that puts off until tomorrow what should be done today. The day you truly conquer laziness, not just for a moment, but as a permanent change, that's the day you'll begin to be truly rich in all the ways that matter. But remember this too, Robert, and remember it well," James continued, his voice taking on added seriousness. "It's not enough to say these things, not enough to make promises that sound good in the moment. Words without action are just air, just sounds that fade away without changing anything. If you really want to change your destiny, to transform your life, you'll have to get up every single day with discipline even when you don't feel like it. You'll have to work even when you're tired, even when rest seems so appealing. You'll have to sow seeds even when the sun burns hot and the work seems endless. Only then will you stop being a slave to laziness and begin building a life of dignity, a life you can be proud of." Robert, with true humility, finally breaking through years of pride and stubbornness, responded, "You're completely right, brother. This time I won't just talk or make empty promises. I will act. I will prove through my actions that I've learned this lesson." And from that moment forward, Robert understood with a clarity he'd never experienced before. It wasn't just advice from his brother anymore, wasn't just words he could dismiss or ignore. It was a truth that had entered the deepest part of his heart, that had changed something fundamental in how he saw the world and his place in it. He understood that life doesn't change through wishes or words or good intentions alone, but through firm steps taken daily, through discipline maintained even when it's difficult, through action that transforms dreams into reality. Robert, reflecting with a voice that grew stronger as he spoke, said to his brother, "Brother, now I see clearly for the first time in my life. I can't keep waiting for life to give me what I haven't earned through my own effort. If I want bread on my table, I must plant the seeds and tend them. If I want warmth in my house, I must work to build it properly and gather the firewood. Starting today, this very moment, I will leave behind the laziness that nearly destroyed me and walk toward becoming the man I should have been all along." "That's it, Robert," his brother responded with joy evident in his voice, with relief that his brother had finally understood. "It's not enough to say, 'Tomorrow I'll do it,' because tomorrow never comes if you don't transform it into today through action. The wealth of life is found in rising early when you'd rather sleep, in sweating with dignity while you work, in not running away from effort even when it's hard. Make each day count like a brick in a building, and soon you'll have constructed your own fortress, your own security that no one can take from you." And so, with a simple piece of bread and a bowl of hot, sweet tea, Robert received the greatest teaching of his life: that laziness leads directly to misery and suffering, but action combined with discipline and consistent effort leads a person to true abundance, to wealth that goes beyond material possessions, to include dignity, security, and peace of mind. Robert spent the winter months with his brother James, who showed him not just brotherly love, but also gave him the most valuable lesson he'd ever receive. When spring finally returned and the earth dressed itself in green once more, when the ice melted and the soil became soft enough to work again, Robert's property waited for him as if forgiving his past mistakes, ready to give him its fruits if he was finally ready to do the work required. Robert, grateful beyond words and determined in a way he'd never been before, left behind the laziness that had condemned him to suffering. From that day forward, he woke early without complaint, cleared his property of weeds and debris, sowed seeds with care and attention, and never again let time slip through his fingers unused. James, for his part, continued to prosper as he always had, but now he did so accompanied by a renewed brother, who finally understood what he'd been trying to teach all along. With the passing years, the two became prosperous farmers, surrounded by strong, healthy cattle and abundant harvests that came year after year. But the most important thing wasn't the wealth visible in their lands, in their full barns and well-maintained homes. It was the wealth in their minds, the understanding they'd gained about life's fundamental principles. Because they understood that true abundance isn't measured by what you have in the moment, but by what you do with what life gives you, by the discipline and effort you're willing to apply consistently, by the wisdom to learn from even the smallest teachers. Discipline and hard work are seeds that always bloom when planted properly, and those who conquer laziness will harvest prosperity that extends beyond material wealth to include peace, dignity, and the satisfaction of knowing you've built something real through your own effort. If you made it to the end of this story, I want to hear from you. What part of this story resonated with you most? Maybe you saw yourself in Robert's struggle, or perhaps you're already walking James's path of consistent effort. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts, your own experiences with overcoming delay and choosing action. This community grows stronger when we share our stories with each other, when we support each other in choosing diligence over comfort. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you won't miss the next story that might change how you see your own life. Thank you for being here with me today.